It's a pleasure to have you here. This is the Critical Minerals Association breakfast webinar. As you know, these are informal, relaxed chats over a cup of tea between experts. And today we're going to be discussing ESG, track, trace, provenance. How do you do more than just write on a piece of paper you're ESG compliant? How do you get that information out there? What's the importance of that? So I am really lucky today to be joined by three experts. We have Jamie, Doug, and Nathan. I'm going to give each one of those a couple of minutes to introduce who they are, where they're from, and what that does. Then we'll get into some questions. And when we've finished our questions, there should be 10, 15 minutes at the end where those in attendance should be able to ask their questions as well. If you do have a question, please put it in the chat, in the Q&A, sorry, and we'll be able to pick it up from there, and we will pick the ones that we can answer quickly in the time that we have. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Jamie. So Jamie, would you want to start by saying who you are, where you're from?
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks to CMA for the opportunity today to have this informal Monday morning breakfast chat. 35 years in the mining finance industry, set up Digbee to mitigate risk within the mining space and hopefully improve execution, which led us to launch the Digbee ESG product earlier this year. It was initiated by some of the leading stakeholders of the industry like BlackRock and Orion Mine Finance. And I think the core thing was to bring the sector together to be able to know what to disclose in the first place, which I think was one of the biggest hurdles for much of the sector, and then to effectively align a set of questions which are right-sized for exploration, development, and production to the global standards, and then to have it independently assessed before being able to have a clear and simple to use communication strategy for both the companies and also the stakeholders in order to assess that ESG right throughout the process. So we're used to COP26 at the moment, really focusing on climate, but I think this sector really needs to understand the full context of ESG in order to improve its perception in the world, which I think is truly justified given the commodities that it produces, which will hopefully transform the world to a sustainable future.
That's grand, thank you. And Douglas, up to you.
Hello, good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity as well this morning. So I'm Doug Johnson-Poensgen. I'm co-founder and chief exec of Circulor. We are a technology business headquartered in London with now sort of offices spawning across the world. And we work pioneering proof in complex industrial supply chains. So what we are looking to do is help, whether it is downstream manufacturers to demonstrate responsible sourcing, or increasingly the inherited carbon that they inherit from their most polluting supply chains. And of course, you know, critical raw materials, mining, turning rock into things that roll is very energy intensive. And also at the upstream end, with very large mining companies looking to differentiate their product and be able to attach ESG metrics to, you know, 200-ton parcels of nickel or whatever coming out of somewhere in Western Australia. And clearly you need to connect the upstream to the downstream via all the midstream participants in these complex supply chains, and the materials change between source and consumption, which is an added little layer of complexity. Otherwise, everything we're talking about this morning would have been done a decade ago. So very much looking forward to this conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you, Doug. And talking about West Australia and source, we hand over to Nathan.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And as the others said as well, it's great to be here today. Not quite in the morning for us, a little bit later in the afternoon, but it's great to be able to join you. I'm Nathan Dubrich. I'm the head of sales for Source Certain International. I've been in the business for a bit over 2 years now, and I really joined this business because with our technology, we believe we can really make a difference. Source Certain is a scientific technology company, as Jeff mentioned, based in Perth, Western Australia. We're global pioneers of scientific provenance technology, patented as TSW Trace. And we're leaders in supply chain integrity solutions across multiple industries, whether it be forestry, seafood, mining, diamond, precious metals, and various agricultural commodities. Through scientific provenance technology, we're able to assist industries and producers fundamentally in creating greater transparency and integrity within their supply chains to help support those key provenance and, as we're talking about today, key ESG claims associated with the production or sourcing of raw materials. Our technology is a physical test of the product, and we're analysing that relationship that exists between both the product itself and the environment and where it come from. And probably importantly for the conversation, as we dive in today, we really do add that additional layer of integrity within a traceability system, where we can then scientifically validate that link between the digital product identifier and its physical twin. So for me, really grateful to be part of it, looking forward to the conversation. And I think it's really important that we can unpack not just ESG, but how we can actually support that and what's available to be able to do that moving forward. So back to you, Jeff.
Cheers, Nathan. Well, I feel like between the three of you, that's done. It's discussion over. It's easy. Just hire all three and you sort it. No, let's be serious. We have just had COP. We're at the back end of COP now. What's people's thoughts in terms of mineral extraction, critical minerals, and ESG coming out of COP? Anyone got a burning thought?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, large gatherings always involve a little bit of what Greta Thunberg would refer to as blah blah blah. But actually, there's some key takeaways. I think the engagement of the financial community now in recognizing its role in trying to drive more ESG compliant behavior and seek evidence of it, I think is a significant change over what happened in Paris. So in Paris, I think the headline was the 1.5 degree commitment, which we all know is challenging. And I think this time, whether it is Rishi Sunak talking about how companies are going to have to report what they're actually doing, or similar themes, discussions in the US and from the SEC and others around meaningful reporting of progress, I think that's a key change. And that's actually where some of us come in. The other theme for me out of it, and of course I'd say this, and clearly I'm biased because I work in supply chains, is I think we all have a growing recognition that supply chains are something we have to understand better. There's always been a very close relationship between a manufacturer and their tier one supplier. But actually, when you look at things like net zero, the amount of emissions inherited from the supply chain by a manufacturer of something that we as a consumer then purchase is a fundamental challenge to achieving the net zero targets. The World Economic Forum published a report at the start of this year called The Supply Chain Opportunity. It referred to sort of 8 very polluting supply chains, saying they accounted for 50% of all global carbon emissions. If you look at supply chains and the total volume of inherited carbon emissions, it's closer to 80% of all global carbon emissions. You cannot manage something you cannot measure and monitor. And that's really, I think, the theme of all three of us in this conversation is how, what sort of technologies are coming out, what sort of effort is required by, industry as a whole in order to engage in an effort to better understand what we inherit in order that we can start to manage it down.
Cheers, Doug.
I'll just add to Doug's comments, and I mean, almost a repetition to say the engagement of the financial community and the opportunity with which COP26 or this entire discussion is having to drive change in all industries. I mean, it was disappointing that mining itself didn't have a greater part to play outside of coal, shall we say, and the discussion around coal, because mining, in the words of Mark Cutifani, drives 45% of the world's economy, but also produces the products which can change the world. And therefore, it was disappointing that we weren't able to come together to highlight that. And maybe that is, to some extent, a figment of the lack of perception which mining has as a name, whether it's within society or whether it's in the financial community or whatever. So I think the fact that climate is leading, which again comes back to, I think, Doug, your comment with regards to the difference between Paris and Glasgow, is that Paris very much kind of got the financial industry's head up maybe above the parapet to say they've got to do something. Now they're really active. Now, I mean, you talk to any of the funds certainly in London and with the benefit of mining, obviously globally around the world, is that London and Europe clearly leading, is that you now almost can't invest without having a proper disclosure of ESG, not just climate, but ESG.
The challenge though with that, sorry to interrupt, obviously we're going to start bouncing off each other, but the challenge with that is, today's disclosures of ESG are, self-reported data and I sent a questionnaire to lots of suppliers and I've tried very hard. And actually, I think what all of us are trying to do is up that game so that there's some meaningful underpinning of that self-declaration of data, which sorry to interrupt you, but I think actually that's something I'd like to unpack a little bit more later in the conversation.
And I think one of the things that came out of Paris, and I'm going to stop and let Nathan chat, but one of the things that came out of Paris was to bring the responsibility to board level. And you can now see within the mining companies, at least the ones that the most advanced, the ones that I'm talking to certainly, are now beginning to understand that the requirement is not only to be brought to board level, but also to actually incorporate it in the heart of strategy. And it is now becoming a reality rather than a myth.
I think that's a good point, Jamie, absolutely. I think now it's not just about what we're talking about. It's not just about having a strategy and releasing a paper to say, look what we're doing. How are we going to validate that? How are we going to back that up? How do we actually comply with some of the ESG requirements? I think your point as well, Douglas, around the responsible investment now is only going to become more and more critical, that investment into organisations, into companies, into this sector in particular, it's going to come with obviously requirements or a level of compliance when it comes to some of those key ESG metrics or credentials. And again, that's where it's going to be so important that we've done so much talk or so much work around talking around what we should be doing, but then what are the solutions? What are the next steps? And how do we actually bring an industry that I think in a way, other industries have moved quicker in regards to some of the framework around how do we actually drive that level of compliance, transparency, trust, all those buzzwords. And I think the mining sector now really has an opportunity for that greater collaboration, and that goes for the industry, but also goes for the technology solutions that sit within that can actually validate these claims and support some of the requirements moving forward for the producers, the industry, and the sector as a whole.
Just want to pick up on a theme that you talked about, Jamie, in terms of the lack of focus on mining, and it's all about coal. I mean, obviously, coal-fired electricity is one of the reasons why my stuff that's mined is so carbon intensive. Yep. So I accept that, but I find that, this is me speaking now as an observer, I find most of the discussion about sustainability is relatively superficial. Electric vehicles are good. Well, kind of, but you have to manufacture them sustainably. The battery and the rest of the supply chain accounts for 70% of the total embedded carbon footprint in an EV inherited by the car manufacturer. And the carbon cost of making an EV is so high that if we don't grip the supply chain challenge around decarbonizing the supply chain and be able to prove it, we might as well stick with petrol and diesel cars. And onshore wind, marvelous for generating sustainable electricity, but what about the steel with which you manufacture it? You shouldn't have to run this thing for 10 years merely to repay the carbon cost of actually constructing it. So, and of course, green steel is a supply chain challenge. So I violently agree with you, Jamie, around, it's a more about, mining as a whole rather than just coal. The other thing, of course, is that, and this is where the finance bit comes in for me, cost of capital and availability of capital is one of the fundamental challenges of running a large corporation. Yeah. And as institutional investors and big institutional lenders start to realize that the sort of scientific solutions we're talking about here, we'll get into that in a little bit more in a second, I'm sure, exist and can support real evidence of what people are actually doing rather than the claims that they make. we will be in a situation, in my view, at least I hope, where it will become a boardroom crisis if you can't access capital at an appropriate cost of capital, and that means you're going to have to do some stuff differently and prove it. And Nathan's business I've admired for a long time, because they use, if you like, forgive me if I'm characterizing it incredibly simply, Nathan, but DNA testing of raw materials. Where did it actually come from? And my business will take that kind of information, plus following that physical digital twin of a commodity all the way through the many steps of transformation that turn rock into things that roll, i.e. cars, in order to provide that kind of proof to which you can attach ESG data all the way along the supply chain, whether it's embedded carbon or workers' rights or water use, wastewater created, whatever it happens to be. And that's possible today, even if it wasn't 4 or 5 years ago. And actually, from a regulatory perspective, and I'm having this conversation a lot in the US, and then I'll shut up and let everybody else talk. Regulators are being convinced sometimes by lobbyists, forgive me for saying this, Jeff, but being convinced by lobbyists that all of this is too complicated and too much of a constraint on commercial freedom. Pardon my use of the vernacular first thing on a Monday morning, but I think that's bullshit. We need to start shaping up and realize that it is possible to properly prove what you're doing.
Yeah, look, Doug, I agree, and to all my lobbyists out there, I'm sorry. Most of us are hired to keep things the way they are.
I'm not having a go at you, Jeff. I think you do a great job.
Most people do. It's fine. But look, I think we've had a really good conversation, and actually, you've all pointed to key issues. And so my next question then is okay, let's look at this from someone brand new, just landed in the game. Where does it begin? Does it begin with understanding? Does it begin with Nathan's track and trace? Does it begin with, so where does it begin? Who's got a...
Yeah, sorry, Joe, I'll jump in there really quickly first, if you like, because I think fundamentally, and this sort of just flows on from what Douglas was saying as well then, the great thing with ESG from our perspective is it begins in relation to provenance. So for us, all of those key claims around environmental or social impacts, it directly relates fundamentally back to that source of origin of where that raw material has come from. So from our perspective, and part of the reason we do actively collaborate, but the unique bit about our technology tying together is that in order to verify ESG claims within a product, we see there's 2 core components. So there's the ESG deliverables at the source of production, and then there's whether or not that product that's in the market has actually been produced from that source. So if we think about certification bodies or regulation, they can certainly verify that first component, but then in relation to the second component, it's that chain of custody standard, or from our perspective, that scientific determination of provenance to then verify that it has come from there. And the important thing really is around that together, ensuring that those supply chains can deliver and they're compliant around those ESG claims. So there's got to be that focus, or there's that strong importance around verifying that specific source or that provenance if we are going to validate those various claims. And just to elaborate very briefly on Douglas's point there, and that's the unique bit about our technology with Source Certain, is that every point of origin, or every the provenance and where a product's come from, by analysing that product, we're analysing a cocktail of elements that are naturally within a product, and that is a direct representation of where that product has come from. So as data is shared, or as claims are made and then transferred or communicated within a supply chain, we can then act as that independent validation that can then give a scientific verification around the origin to then help underpin those various ESG metrics or claims that are then being verified through a third-party certification program, or it could be simply through information or data that through Circulor with Douglas company there, that they're communicating through a digital platform but really critical that we can bring that all together and fundamentally, I guess, understand around that it all starts at that specific point of provenance.
And Nathan, if I may quickly, how small a scale are we talking in terms of on a map? Are we talking like a 1 mile radius, a 500 meter radius? What are we talking about?
Yeah, and that's the thing. Without giving a specific, I guess, a detailed measurement or whatever it may be in regards to how close, but fundamentally, what sets our technology apart from even other scientific provenance tools is the specificity around our determination of provenance. So we can get down to a kimberlite pipe, for example, on a mine site. If we're talking agriculture, we can get to a specific block within a broader farm or orchard. So it's very specific around our determination of provenance, and that comes from two parts. It comes from how do we structure our programs, which is probably a much more detailed conversation outside of probably today, but it's also fundamentally we're pretty much analysing almost the entire periodic table. Yep. So therefore we can then understand, I guess, that direct representation or what we're seeing from that cocktail of elements from that specific location. And then the way in which we do analyse and the way in which we've pioneered our methods in particular, then allows us to be very specific, which is really important because we're talking ESG, we're talking a site, we're talking a location, we're talking a farm, a mine site, in relation to then the practices and the way in which they're operating in conjunction with that physical check through an audit.
Jeff, can I jump in?
I was about to come to you.
No, well, first of all, I need to take my hat off to you for putting this together, because if you take the three of us here, or the four of us by you putting it together, but you take the three of us here and you go back to that original question of how are we going to do something about it rather than just talking about it. This is the most unique conversation that I've certainly been involved in for the last 6 months, because there's too much going on about how do we, or the talk about it, and that this is actually the real detail. And what I find is Nathan's comment there with regards to site. There's too much generic stuff going on, and which is great from the corporate side of it. And I understand why ESG almost started out in that way. But in the case of mining, and no doubt so many other industries, orchards you've been talking about, and agriculture, no doubt the same, just not in that area, is the site-specific stuff is so important. And if you can get the DNA, excuse me again for simplifying it, but if you can get the DNA of that bit of ore, in the case of a mine, or probably that apple as well in the orchard, but that bit of ore, then that in itself is core to Doug having going through the whole way through the supply chain for it then to become out in rolling wheels or whatever it happens to be. But what also needs to be done is the other 35 different topics which are included within the ESG matrix, whether or not it's waste management, rehabilitation, water stress, water quality,
indigenous rights, all sorts.
Exactly, all of that stuff, which is so difficult to bring in. And I'm sure you want to talk about self-assessments and everything, but to make sure that you do get quality data going into the system that can be validated, so that in effect, you get a result that comes out of it going through everything that Doug does, to ultimately then means that we have a safeguard or a fail-safe system where Apple or whoever it happens to be can rely upon at the end. And if that happens, the financial success of the mining companies in the sector as a whole, going from the worst perception in the industry, in the world as an industry, can skyrocket. I mean, to me, it is the greatest form of communication by dealing with real ESG and real provenance and real clarity, which can effectively create that.
So I just want to pull apart two things. So provenance is directly relevant to the broader question of responsible sourcing. Is there any child labor? Where did it actually come from, etc.? You know, is this a source of material from somewhere that's been deforested? You know, what are the working conditions like for the people on the ground? And although, you know, there's two of us here that are technology platform providers, technology, like all technology, we all know this, rubbish in, rubbish out. You know, so the quality of the data that you can input at the start is obviously key. That's where the provenance bit comes in. Then, of course, you need a reliable chain of custody. And the challenge with mined materials, given that we're talking about critical minerals, is that they undergo change from rock to car or rock to wind turbine. And so that change is a combination of chemical transformation that will be smelting and refining, amalgamation with other materials, eventually creating, you know, components that end up in sub-assemblies that might eventually become a car. And so, you know, clearly the sort of the DNA testing of the material is not possible after you've heated it up to 1500 degrees centigrade and turned it into something that's chemically completely different. But it's very important to that first part. And by the way, I'm in no way undermining Source Certain. We're actively exploring ways of working together. I think it's a brilliant technology. But of course, some of the challenges, how do you follow material through each of those stages of transformation? And the way that we do it is, I often use the analogy of a cake recipe. So much flour, so many eggs, so much sugar goes through a defined mixing process. You need a certain type of equipment to do that in your kitchen, and then it goes into an oven for an hour. At the end, you get a cake. If you have 20 cakes, you've clearly added material other than from that one bag of flour. And if you do it like Delia Smith in 3 minutes, here's one I made earlier, it's clearly not come from a bag of flour that you claim it came from. So just remember that principle of a cake recipe, and that's how you can start to, if you like, code the business rules, the elapsed time that defines how certain ingredients go into a process and come out of the other end. Now, clearly, for mined materials, those are batch processes, you know, a bit like a cake recipe. For things like the chemical recycling of plastic waste, those are continuous distillation processes. So, and we've actually just done a project with Total demonstrating how you can use the same approach to traceability specifically to things that are continuously being distilled as opposed to batch processes. So that combination of detailed information about what, you know, where something's come from, plus the ability to create a chain of custody, means you can then attach other data to it. Everything Jamie was just talking about in terms of all of the broad range of ESG metrics. Carbon, of course, is the one that we all talk about today, but the broad range of ESG metrics, you can capture data at each step of that process and attach it to that flow of materials. An attributable slice of embedded carbon or an attributable slice of any other metric that you want. And that's what gives that proof at the downstream for, you know, financial institutions, for example, that if they're going to fund, you know, a car manufacturer or a factory or, you know, a new gigafactory like British Volt, with whom we're working, who are looking to have, you know, both green construction and also responsibly sourced and greener battery materials, all of that relies on this provenance and chain of custody that we're talking about here on this call. So sorry to just abstract for a second. I just thought that would be helpful.
Yeah. No, it's really useful. And I'm looking at the time and I'm thinking, geez, we could go on for hours, because I think actually this is a great conversation, and we've unpacked so much, but the more we talk about it, the more I realize there's just so much more that needs to be discussed and looked at. So look, in my brain, you've got understanding the ESG necessities, and Jamie, I know that's, you know, an area of your expertise on the one side. So understanding that side of things. Then you've got Nathan on the other side, which is you know, understanding exactly where it's come from. You know, I'm sure at some point, Nathan, you're going to be what 3 words and it's from exactly here, done. So you've got those two, and then you can use Circulor with the blockchain, so that's almost your 2 feet, and then you've got the spine, which is blockchain tracking it through the supply chain. So I've got a couple of questions, and they kind of all fit together. My first question is, given the remoteness of some of these operations, is self-assessment the only way that this can be done, but given the remoteness? So that's my first question. Doug and Jamie both shake their heads and look to me like I'm an idiot, so I'm guessing that's the no. So that's the first one, and Nathan's now laughing as well. So okay, so we'll take it. So basically, the argument that but our site is so far into the wilderness that we have to do self-assessment. That's the only way we can do it. That you're all basically saying no, that's not good enough. That's not an argument.
Yeah. So I mean, you can take self-reported data, but obviously you're testing its credibility. You're looking for anomalies in that self-reported data, and you can augment it with information from whether it is auditors or other on-site actors. Particularly in places, for example, like the Congo, you have a whole panoply of different actors, from NGOs to auditors and others, observing what is going on and reporting on, plus whistleblowing mechanisms, and increasingly uses of technology, for example, machine vision on aerial imagery, to observe what is going on in real time in order to compare claims with what an auditor may say. Obviously, the day that the auditor turns up, there's no kids on site and everybody's in the classroom and it's all wonderful, and but what happens the day after? So how can you observe remotely a site alongside all those other mechanisms and augment that data with what you can, what is self-reported?
Well, sorry, just off the top of my head, you get a satellite to ping an image back to the blockchain every couple of days.
You get the satellite imagery. You need to analyze it so that you can, for example, compare claimed production levels with possibly geology or even the level of activity at a site. And you can get commercially available satellite imagery now that's good enough to be able to identify the difference between children and adults, and observe working conditions, and also informal activity around what is a managed site.
Okay.
And I think Doug's touched on kind of quite a few of these areas. I mean, from our point of view, is that we have started out with initially self-reporting, or self-reporting is wrong, as self-assessment, but based on a very pertinent set of questions which have effectively been aligned to the global standards. And that's where your initial data must come from. It's going to be very, very difficult to turn it over to a pure audit type structure. And in the case of the mining industry, 2,700, I think it is, public companies, let alone how many private companies which go under a lot of that radar. So it's very, very difficult to suddenly say we can address this issue if you're not going to get the managements on board. So therefore, encourage managements to get on board, to reward them with a direction of travel which will hopefully work, ultimately going back to Doug, your original point of rate of returns or cost of capital effectively. So effectively,
if you can't get financing, then that's fairly strong motivator.
Exactly. So then you need to make sure you get that data, whichever you're collecting, is then supported and is corroborated. Whatever, now that comes from so many different areas because it covers so many different topics. So whether or not, I mean, some very basic stuff is, first of all, ask the right questions. Secondly, get supporting evidence from the company to support that. Thirdly, bring it up to the level of the board where there's a level of responsibility similar to that of accounting or to financial reports. Then get it independently assessed, rather than just assuming, right, we're there, we can box tick at that stage. Get it independently assessed. And if you get the right people to assess it, you've then got the double qualification, because they can normally pick holes where things may or may not go wrong. And then from that effect, make sure it's transparent. We actually haven't used the word transparent yet, but I suspect all three of us agree with, in principle, the simple terminology of transparency. I always say, if you've got a producing mining company throwing acid into the river and all these fish are bobbing up further down the river and your next door neighbor's seeing that, then that AAA rated company or project up the road clearly isn't going to stay AAA rated very, very long. The internet's a big, strong promoter of that. So I think there's a number of things, and then you, of course, support all of that with things which Doug was saying, whether or not it's satellite imagery, drone technology, or whatever, which can be done either in real time or pretty close to real time, and that will be further enhanced over the course of the next few years.
Okay. Lester Kemp's just come up on chat, by the way, talking about use of drones already by mining companies. Completely agree.
And then
I think the other point too, which is really, sorry, I was going to say the one other point I'll add to that though is that whole notion of remoteness, and obviously, and we've all experienced in the last 2 years is probably a really good example of that, where we do have, I guess, greater restrictions or the inability to potentially get to a mine site to validate some of these claims or verify some of the self-assessment that's going on, I think two things are really clear. One is there's been a significant growth in the focus around some of the third-party certification, which is important to validate, sort of to your point, Jamie, around some of that self-assessment information or data. And we've seen it in other industries through the likes of ASC, MSC, FSC for forestry, etc. But the remoteness now, and this is why it's so important that we all of us play a key role in the midst of issues like COVID and restrictions of travel and getting to places. What we can offer is still that continuation of a solution or a service where we can continuously still test product at certain points of a supply chain to still add that level of independent validation if for some reason that third-party certification body or just access to data, for example, may be more difficult if other challenges pop up like COVID, other restrictions and things like that. So just further validates or demonstrates the need to have those multiple solutions that you can chop and change as you need to, or if one drops off because of issues that are out of your control, other parts of that solution can still operate and be effective.
Yeah, I was going to say, from the conversation we've just had, the easiest thing if there's a failure would be to say, oh, it's not our rocks, it's not our minerals, and then obviously it comes back to you, and you're like, well, sorry, buddy, but here's the proof that it is. Jamie, you had your hand up.
Just one thing I just wanted to add is obviously with regards to the mining space, and I respect both the other gentlemen are not specific to mining where we are, is we must remember that 85% plus of the mining space don't produce revenue or don't produce ore. Yet, in order for those assets, which hopefully will become producing assets at one stage, to hold their test of time and to be regarded as low ESG risk for anybody who might take them on or effectively invest in them in the future, is that we need to make sure that we encourage that 85% of the industry to have the right ESG credentials, have the right journey in place, have the right baselines in place in order to get them to be able to be financed, because they still fall under the radar of, are you disclosing appropriately right at the beginning? And then obviously to make sure that that de-risking process for an M&A point of view or whatever allows that then to go through to the process. So having a right-sized approach for the right status of that company to give those management the chances to be rewarded, but also to make sure that they're well placed for the future.
We're working with some of those small pre-production miners, hoovering up a reasonable number in Australia at the moment, particularly in lithium, who are looking to do just that, set themselves up right in order that their product can be differentiated when they have it. An example would be Vulcan Energy and their low carbon lithium, and being able to prove it from the before anyone digs anything up. By the way, we have a couple of questions from Max on the Q&A, which I thought quite interesting, because the first one, the first question is, do mine operators need to invest more directly in their supply chains, i.e. ships, ports, railways, if they're going to decarbonize their supply chains, or can they simply collaborate with carriers on technologies such as blockchain? So the first thing is obviously scope 3 emissions is what you inherit, but also the impact of what you do afterwards. And so certainly the large mining companies like BHP, with whom we work with, are looking both in terms of their inherited emissions, their own operations, which is scope 1 and 2, and increasingly seeking to work with their ultimate downstream customer to sort of bookend the supply chain and try and find a way to make sure that their more sustainable nickel, for want of a better way of describing it, for example, doesn't lose all of those potential sustainability benefits by the midstream participants acting in relatively uncontrolled behavior driven entirely by the old economics.
So if I can just jump in there.
Sorry, carry on.
No, of course. But that leads me perfectly to my next question, which I think you're going to answer in the next sentence. But so the next question was basically very simple. Is we look at the way that the industry is structured. So mineral extraction, midstream production, and then the downstream OEMs and component manufacturers. And the question is quite simple to ask, but probably very hard to answer, which is, do we have to deal with this track, trace, provenance, ESG understanding and articulation at a company by company, or do we do it by entire supply chain. And I guess it's, I don't know.
Entire supply chains, because the flow of materials is not linear. I mean, sorry, the reason why my company is called Circulor, which is the Latin word for to come together in a group, is this is an ecosystem play. By the way, and the answer to this question is relevant to the question that Simon Salters just asked on the Q&A, which is, there's no mention of the EU plans to require mandatory ESG due diligence in supply chains. And an example of that would be the battery regulations, where, one will need to have an embedded carbon figure per battery. And the reason for that is that depending on which midstream actors got involved over time in the production of various elements of the raw materials, and at the moment that midstream is governed entirely by availability and price rather than any consideration of ESG or carbon footprint, you can have a wildly different carbon intensity in a battery. And we did some work with Daimler at the start of last year, where month on month, the same EV battery for the same car model could have up to 4 times the embedded carbon, merely because of this uncontrolled behavior by the midstream. Of course, it's uncontrolled. We've never focused on it. We've never been able to measure it and manage it before. So the point that Simon is making is a very good one. Whether you have a supply chain law in Germany or things like battery regulations and the impending carbon border adjustment taxes, those themes will start to drive what we're talking about here. And it's not, individual actors cannot do this on their own. You have to connect into these sort of ecosystem plays to create this flow of data about the flow of materials through the supply chain. By the way, what Biden's trying to do in the US with the infrastructure law and their concerns around strategic over-reliance on Chinese supply chains and the importance of keeping critical raw materials like battery materials in the US once they get there, it will drive exactly the same behavior that we have in Europe under the Green Deal and Fit for 50. Okay. Around understanding ESG right the way through supply chains.
So to play devil's advocate, I actually completely agree with you, and I think the reality is the downstream user, whether it's a car manufacturer or a construction firm, whoever it may be, is going to have to they're going to have to demonstrate that they are ESG compliant, and because they are predominantly the society-facing end of the supply chain, the PR backlash, should they fail, is most necessarily going to be upon them. Yeah. But if I then take it back, because throughout the supply chain, it's not owned by a single company. There's multiple companies. Let's simplify the supply chain down to 5 stages: extraction, processing, refining, beneficiation, into wherever it is, and you have a different company owning different parts of that process. Where does the single company, and I guess this is where Jamie comes in when he's talking about trying to get demonstrate this for a single company in terms of attracting finance, and how so they obviously have a role to play as well without thinking about the larger one, but the larger one is obviously how we solve the larger problem, if you get what I mean. That was terrible English. I apologize. I hope you understand.
I slightly understand. I mean, look, it's so important that we encourage the smaller part of this sector, the explorers and developers, to get on board with ESG disclosure for their own sake, let alone for the sake of the planet and everything else, because the financial world has just now moved leaps and bounds ahead in order to provide capital. So we just need to make sure that, I don't think I'm necessarily answering your question, by the way, Jeff, but we do need to do that. And just going back to Max's answer, Max's question, that it's not just a lack of money, it's also a lack of resources internally for these smaller companies. How can a management team identify 30+ topics to disclose upon when they never had to 2 years ago or 6 months ago? So we need to be able to help that. And Digbee, being openly commercial about it, we give our frameworks out for free. So there's no excuse now for the mining industry not to disclose ESG and know what to disclose. Now, if they want to go for an independent assessment, that's when we raised an invoice to them. But the frameworks are completely free to access once you've just registered online. So excellent. This industry can now get up and going and just do their own disclosure if they want to do that. and in whatever way they want. We want it to be harmonious. We want it to be standardized, because that allows all the other benefits that come out from it. But there's now no excuse for companies to effectively do that. So, and that I think will really help. I think it will help break this increasing M&A. There's a risk that M&A is critical to the mining industry. I mean, most explorers wouldn't get involved. And Nathan, you probably from Western Australia, most of your friends, I suspect, you know, who might be in the exploration world, they wouldn't get involved if it wasn't for M&A. So, I mean, you know, the idea of having a 10-bag win and everything else like that has been, you know, been the foundation of mining for decades or centuries. So we need to make sure that M&A is not hindered as a result of ESG, which I think is increasingly a risk because of the scorecards of majors and other producers who are going to get involved. And if we can effectively address that quickly, then I think that's an important unlocking of value as well.
Yeah, I think
Sorry, Jeff, I don't think that answered your question at all.
No, but I think it all relates though, Jamie, and I think even with your points as well, Douglas, is that there's a challenge here of who goes first, who owns this, who pays for it. And it's been an ongoing conversation I know we've had at who in the supply chain pays for this. And I think the simple answer is
consumers should.
I think the consumers
got addicted to cheap, which of course we all like. Yes. But ultimately, if
this is the little bit of the unknown, but what we all hope for is that the cost gets passed through to the consumer, because they have more trust and confidence that what they're purchasing has done the right thing in the environment by the people that have produced it, and therefore they're happy to pay more. And that cost then gets passed down the chain all the way back to even to the mine producer themselves. I think there's got to be a level, I believe, of industry and government collaboration as well, because we need to be able to set the framework in which I guess the industry can operate. And that then comes down to what elements are needed to deliver on all the things we're talking about. And then it helps to then, in some ways, amortize some of those costs, or helps to subsidize some of those costs from an industry or government level, which then makes it more achievable for your mine producer that may not want to, I guess, invest in a whole solution, or you might have the OEM now that's going to have more pressure to actually invest in these programs to better validate where that raw material is going into their products.
There's another source of money here too. Supply chains to tier N until now have been largely undigitized. We all know that digitizing a business process can help drive efficiency. There's a massive amount of working capital tied up in these complex global industrial supply chains, where, you know, and ultimately that cost of working capital finds its way into the cost of the end product to the car manufacturer or whoever it happens to be. And when you digitize a supply chain and you understand what is where and when it arrives and all the rest of it, you can actually speed up the process. I mean, we all know how wildly inefficient the paper processes of, you know, bills of lading and you know, goods in and invoicing and blah, blah. I mean, there's an enormous amount of cost tied up in inefficiency from paper-based processes in these global supply chains. And there is a source of opportunity there from a commercial perspective, well beyond just asking the consumer to pay more. Although I believe personally, and obviously I've drunk the Kool-Aid because I've got young kids and they poke me in the chest and say, what are you doing about it, Daddy? But, you know, I'm happy to pay more for things that have been responsibly made and you know, and hopefully sustainably. Clearly, that is not yet ubiquitous across society, even though the reality is we are carrying these costs. But there's another opportunity, which is supply chain digitization, which is exactly what we all contribute to.
So
the counter argument too, Douglas, is what's the cost if we don't do anything? That's the counter argument as well.
Don't go there. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So,
Jeff, just one thing, just a digression from what Doug was saying about other sources of capital. I just wanted to, I thought this was an amazing fact that I came up last week, is that there's going to be $500 billion worth of green bonds issued in the world this year. The mining industry in its entire history has tapped 4 billion, of which I think a large part of that was Newmont's facility, which probably has never been touched on given the amount of money they're making at the moment. So we're effectively frozen out of this industry. And from 2 conversations I've had with commercial banks in the course of the last 2 weeks, where we're trying to address this, is that they have highlighted that credit committees are now unprepared. They're simply not prepared to invest in extractive industries at the moment because of the risk of NGOs, and therefore, I guess, on their reputation. And the reason for that is not because they're just scared, it's because they don't have any credible data in which to rely upon in order to fight back.
Completely.
And we need, and that must be, to me, is the core of why we're talking now and why this whole process is moving in its juggernaut way it is at the moment.
So I have maybe one statement on the back of that, which I think you may or may not agree with, all three of you, and then one final question before we go to any last questions that we've been asked. But my statement then is, if we can find a way of enhancing mineral extraction to the point where they can prove their provenance, they can meet standard ESG, and they can see that they can get themselves onto the blockchain system, which allows them to be more easily integrated into the wider entire supply chain system. That, I guess what that does is, instead of making them a negative in the eyes of some, suddenly become a positive, make it easier to attract finance, make it easier to be picked up by these larger supply or larger OEMs at the downstream, who are looking past now the easy to see, but to the wider, mineral extraction community.
Yeah.
So do we agree?
The energy transition is completely impossible without mining.
Yeah.
You can't make. Sorry?
2 words: yes, and credibility.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mining is essential to the energy transition. We have to get a grip of this.
Okay. So I think then we're all in agreement on that statement, which is great. So everyone has a part to play. It does get, there was a couple of questions I wanted to get into, which I don't think we're going to have time for now. So the first one was, so where, I guess this is more to Doug than anyone else, because kind of, it's the downstream players who are going to be the ones who are most affected by negative PR. So let's say their product is marketed as net zero. VW did that recently with an ID3 or ID4.
ID3, yeah.
ID3.
And they did it with offsets, and everyone went, yeah, right.
Right. Okay. Exactly. So suddenly the PR becomes quite negative in terms of, and it's them that gets hit with it. By the way, I saw an ID3 the other day. It was awesome. But that's by the by. There are other producers out there. So where do those, very quickly, Doug, where do the final OEMs fit in this? Do they have to pay for the,
Well, I mean, so obviously the benefit of traceability all the way through a supply chain accrues at the downstream. So most of our big customers are car manufacturers who are looking to create their own version of a battery passport, to understand the responsible sourcing of the cobalt that ends up in their batteries, or the traceability of their leather all the way back to the source, so that they can be confident it's not a source of deforestation. So clearly that is part of it, but there's always been a cost in, for example, a car manufacturer, in understanding some of the risks that they inherit from their supply chain, as well as questions of supply chain resilience, supply quality, etc. So this is part of the cost of doing business if you are a car manufacturer or a plane maker like Boeing. We've obviously spent some time here talking about the upstream actors and their access to capital. I think our real challenge is the midstream. Many of these complex supply chains go through very large actors, tier 2, 3, 4, 5 in supply chains, many of which are in Asia. Some are absolutely getting this and wanting to differentiate themselves over others by contributing to traceability and looking to improve their operations from a whole variety of different ESG perspectives. And for others, it's not yet a priority. And it's not a priority because there are parts of the world that perhaps still prioritize price over, broader questions of ESG. If you are manufacturing batteries that don't have, you're not too concerned about the carbon footprint, there will be lots of people who will be very interested in buying those batteries. Possibly also in Asia or other places. And so for some time there will be a market. But actually, if you want to sell into Europe, if you want to sell into the US, then provenance and traceability will increasingly, in my view, be a core part of what you have to do.
Okay, so Max and Lester, thank you for being quite active on the questions and chats. But I guess I had, and we could keep this going for hours, I'm sure, because I'm really enjoying it. I'm sure you guys have got better things to do, but I'm really enjoying it. I think there's so many good things that have come out. But I had kind of two questions, and I think that perhaps we don't have time for both. So I'll pick one, which is, we've seen a split on COP. Russia and China didn't attend. On a number of different things, we're starting to see bipolarization at the top of the political arena in globally, right? Do we see a point where, I guess my question is, do we see a point where ESG will either be centralized and all parties globally will pull together around agreed standards, or do we see a splitting of that where ESG perhaps, and we've spoken about this in a previous one, which is tracking your it goes back to Nathan, I guess, tracking your critical mineral and being able to demonstrate that's ESG compliant, almost creates another level of criticality, because I want lithium, I can either get it from here or I can get this ESG accredited lithium, which may be 2 pence more expensive. But so do we see a splitting? Do we see ESG creating a new market? Where do we think it's going?
Jamie, you go first. I've got a comment.
Well, to me, I think Biden was absolutely right in his answer. Look, it's disappointing they weren't included, but frankly, I think they're missing a huge opportunity. And, you know, at the end of the day, whatever your persuasion politically is we saw what the people of China didn't like, and it was the smog and the problems of emissions that went on, was it, you know, kind of 10 years ago, which has led them to cutting down coal-fired power stations on a regular basis to clean up the air. Sadly, they're still building them. But nevertheless, they are taking action to reduce the smog and the emissions that are going on inside the country. So to me, I think it's tail wagging the dog. I think ultimately they will come on board because cleaner is better. And it's common sense. It goes back to your original point. So, and I think the other thing probably worth pointing out is the differential in pricing, which you mentioned. Look at, you know, what happened in the iron ore market, which happened for a number of different reasons, and probably Doug being down in Oz is probably better. Sorry, not Doug, as Nathan was better placed than me, but there's clearly going to be different, in my mind, there's clearly going to be differential in pricing of commodities, which are, call it green and non-green types of commodities, keep it simple and short. And I think that impacts China very dynamically as a consumer of all of these things. So to me, I think it was a missing of an opportunity, which is sad and disappointing, but ultimately I'm an optimist and a positive, and I think ultimately they will come on board for the better of the people.
Yeah, I'm with you. The only reason why some random company in China makes NCM precursor is because folks want batteries. And if the requirement from Europe and North America is I want green batteries, guess what? There will be people making more sustainable NCM precursor or cathode or make up something in the midstream. It will happen because of economics. Now, that won't cover the whole global problem. And of course, President Xi has already declared that China will be carbon neutral by 2030. Unlike most politicians around the world, I have a sense that the Chinese approach of declaration from the leader that something will happen probably means it really will, even if 2060 is a bit late for some of us. But you know, I'm not sure I have quite the same confidence in some of our leaders in the West when they say it will happen. That doesn't necessarily mean it will. So I think it'll happen faster because of economics. If the only way to sell your stuff is to have made it more sustainably and to have traceability, for example, for an EU battery passport, well then guess what? You want to sell your stuff in Europe, that's what you're going to have to do, just the cost of doing business.
Yeah, and we're seeing that already, I think, Douglas, too, that there's enough aligned countries that I think, whether you want to call it a roadmap or a strategic plan or whatever they're calling them at the moment, but there is some general consistency and alignment in some ways. It's now about how do we actually get proper alignment and try and get to that global standard or that global trust mark in relation to the critical mineral sector in particular. And I think it's important too, I think this ties back to one of Max's questions before. I think from our perspective, especially, everything we do is around inclusion, not exclusion. And we don't want to necessarily, nor can we, walk away from some regions where some of these key commodities are being sourced from. But we do want to make sure there is a greater level of transparency and trust in how things are being done. And that's only going to come through framework, through standards, and through technology that can complement each other, can come together, and can give people a chance in every region to then trade on a global scale in a sustainable, ethical, and responsible way.
Perfect. Look, guys, I'm just going through the chat and the questions. So is this an opportunity for the LSE to grade different metals in terms of how green they are? Jamie's responded to that and said probably yes.
Yeah, although I think Lester, I think he meant LME, not LSE.
Yeah, LME, that's right. Yeah. Don't worry, it's early. Well, and it's not for you.
So the LME has had a sustainability strategy for a while, which sees a spot market with ESG claims being underpinned by providers like us. The CME, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, undoubtedly is thinking similar thoughts about how to enable a trade in more sustainable materials, because there's obviously a demand for it. And so, I mean, we just signed a 7-year deal with Trafigura to provide traceability for their nickel and cobalt operations. And all of that is because Trafigura, obviously, as probably the largest metals trader in the world, sees that there is a demand for responsibly and sustainably produced metals.
There you go. Okay. Actually, all the other questions that we've had, we've answered throughout this conversation.
I would just touch, Jeff. I think one of the earlier ones was just on recruitment, which I just think is just, which was answered, but on the line. But I think that's just so important. I mean, recruitment for the mining industry, it goes back with the M&A thing and all these other things. If you can encourage the fact that mining is just not a simple binary negative to the world, then you will increase recruitment into this sector, and particularly with the improvement in working conditions which have happened over the last 20 or 30 years, irrelevant of the modern day ESG, and the improvement for female workers and others to get into the sector. Frankly, I think all you need is better, whether it's provenance, whether it's better communication, whether it's just a means to be able to understand and have confidence in the credibility of the company and or its other associations to be embracing ESG. I think that's great for the industry and world generally.
I completely agree, and it's something that I've often said as a mantra: is we can't say that we're going to build a better, greener economy of tomorrow if we accept a responsibility today. And the perception of the mineral extraction sector, the critical mineral sector, is not great. Often that's unjustified, often that's unfounded, but it's because we as an industry are not the best at explaining these things. What you've demonstrated today is, every single one of your companies has a role to play in demonstrating that your project or your supply chain in its entirety is as good as it can be in terms of ESG. What does that do? That opens up more people to join. That opens up more finance opportunities. It opens up, your markets, but it actually increases your PR. Being a comms person, I mean, VW did it. Might not necessarily agree the way they did it, but they did it, and that all starts by taking simple steps. Finance will be an issue in terms of these. There's always going to cost attributed to this. That cost we do hope will be passed down, and I know Circulor, you have a way that some of your end users have helped some of your upstream by financing their addition to your system. We've spoken about having additions onto the blockchain system, satellites, drones, etc., third party accreditation. It's all there. It can all be done. And going back to what Jamie said at the beginning, it's moving from talking about it to how do you actually do it. And I think in an hour and 4 minutes, we've probably opened up the first little bit of this conversation. And I think it's significantly larger, but what I've learned is what I so poorly tried to say earlier, which is that every single company in the supply chain has a role to play in terms of doing what they need to do. And then that feeds into the wider, much larger blockchain attributed supply chain for the OEM. And only by collaboration. So it's almost that, yes, you have to act individually to meet those ESG standards, but equally you have to collaborate together to get that across. And you can't do that alone. So I have found this incredibly interesting. I could talk to you guys for another 7 hours on this. I think it's so much, and we'll probably come back and do another one. I just want to say thank you. I'm going to give each one of you, a couple of minutes to sum up. So we'll go in reverse order this time. So we'll start with Nathan.
Yeah, I'll keep it fairly brief. But again, Jeff, thanks so much. It's great to be part of this today and to join Jamie and Douglas as well. And I think what's really clear is we have a great opportunity. There's technology available. There's a clear need to be able to collaborate and bring that together, because no one solution is going to fix or be able to, I guess, support all these challenges that we're facing around ESG moving forward. But I guess the opportunity is today. It's never been more in focus. There's never been more demand coming from, like we said before, from the consumer end. And they're going to demand more. They're going to ask more questions. They're going to want to validate the claims that are associated with them paying a premium for a product. And there's got to be means and ways in which we can do that in a way they understand, and most importantly, in a way that we can indisputably validate and verify those key ESG claims associated with the production of a number of these, I guess, end products that we're all using on a daily basis. So we're excited to be part of the conversations. We're excited to collaborate with industry and other key solutions like Jamie, like Douglas, with Digbee and Circulor. And we think if we can take action now, if we can stop the conversation and start the action around putting in place some of these solutions, we can start achieving some of these targets and goals. And most importantly, I guess, demonstrating change a lot quicker than what we may have thought otherwise. So again, I'll pass over to Jamie or Douglas, but again, thanks, Jeff. And it's a privilege to be part of this, and more importantly, part of that conversation as to how we can make a real difference.
It's been a pleasure. Right, we'll go. Thanks, Nathan. We'll pass over to Doug.
Yeah. So my parting thought is that, we've talked about technology and its role in provenance and traceability today. These solutions are going mainstream. This is not proof of concept or piloting. When massive commodity traders like Trafigura and car manufacturers like Daimler start adopting solutions like this and requiring their supply chain to do it, we're well beyond the pioneers and the weirdos into this is the way that business will be done. So I would encourage those listening to go, this isn't something that might be a solution in 10 years' time. It's possible and at scale in complex supply chains now.
Perfect. Thanks, Doug. And Jamie.
Well, how can I follow up after those two? I mean, look, I think all I would say is, again, thank you, Jeff, and the team for putting this on behalf of us all. I think it's been brilliant. The speed with which this is moving is rapid at any regard. I mean, in my young 50-odd years, I don't think I've seen an industry call ESG an industry move as quick as anything else. I mean, this is rapid, and we're now beginning to get into that phase of doing, which these gentlemen have highlighted, and I think collaboration is a critical part of that. And so therefore, what we really need to do for this industry, at least for the mining industry, is also to communicate. And if we can effectively do that and we can effectively get credible evidence to support real ESG, real provenance, then let's make sure that we communicate it, because that has the upside, which probably has not really been fully examined and determined from an industry that is not well regarded at the moment.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you ever so much. I'm sure at some point we're going to come back to you guys for another one of these, because I think there's so much we can discuss. Everyone watching, I mean, the solution is there. We've got 3 companies here who basically can prove and help you be ESG compliant and get that there. We can't build the world without critical minerals. We can't build that green economy without critical minerals. They need to be ESG compliant. Otherwise, you're not building a green world. It's that simple. The technology is there. The methods of understanding it are there. The fingerprints are there. So thank you ever so much, everyone. We'll have another webinar next month. Thank you, chaps. Really appreciate it. If anyone out there wants to get in touch, either find these guys via their websites or come to us and we'll put you in touch as well. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.